This video is the setup for SpaceOAR. For SpaceOAR, or transperineal fiducial markers, we use the biplane probe. So that's the probe that's longer and it has two crystals on it. You can see the long crystal running along the length of the end of the probe. That's the sagittal crystal. And the circular crystal at the tip of the probe is the axial crystal. So it's different from the other probe, the C41V, which we use for transrectal biopsy, in that with that probe, you can just turn the probe 90 degrees to see sagittal and then axial. This probe here stays in this position, and just by moving in and out, you put the gland over the crystal that you want to see. So if you want to see sagittal, you use this crystal. If you want to see axial, you use this crystal. This line here represents the center of the sagittal crystal. So the urologist will use this line as a guide when they're trying to keep the needle perfectly over the crystal, because obviously this part is in the patient's rectum, so all they'll see is this. So that way they know, just by turning the probe, how to keep the needle over the crystal. Basically, they're going to turn so this line is under the needle. So this probe here has two connectors for each crystal, as opposed to the C41V, which has only one connector. So obviously each crystal has its own connector, and you can tell which one it is by looking at these pictures. So this linear kind of square shape is the sagittal connector. And then this one obviously is the axial, but you can tell because it has that fan shape. So just like how we see the gland with the C41V in axial, if you can imagine the picture, it has this kind of shape on the monitor. So this is the axial crystal connector. So for these procedures, in order to use both connectors, we need to use the adapter on the ultrasound. So normally you would just plug the C41V into this port on the ultrasound, but we only have one port, so how we're going to plug in two connectors? We're going to use the adapter. So the adapter is on the side of the ultrasound. You can see it has this plug here, this connector, so it might be plugged in already. You can just unplug it. And this plug here will plug into the port on the ultrasound, just as if you were doing a regular biopsy. So that plugs in there, and then that gives you these two ports here. This port down here, the big one, is for a different type of probe, which we do not use. We only use these two. And it doesn't matter which one you plug, which plug into, as long as they're both plugged in. So the same concept, just make sure you seat it firmly and then lift up to lock it. You always want to come in at a straight on approach. You don't want to come in at an angle because it might bend one of these pins inside the connector. If you can see in there, there's little pins along the sides of those ports. So you want to always come in at a straight on approach and just press firmly and then lock it. So once you've plugged in the adapter and the two connectors and the ultrasound is on, you'll see this screen appear automatically. And what you want to make sure is that this Artemis name comes up for both of the connectors and both crystals. So you can see here, this is the sagittal. See that image again, the square? This is the axial. So for each one, you want to make sure that that profile shows up. If it doesn't show up, sometimes you can try reseating them. Sometimes the plug, when you plug it in, it doesn't detect it. You can try taking it out and plugging it back in again. If you see that it's listed over here, you can also click this button and just select it, from over here. You just want to make sure that it's saying Artemis on both of them. If you don't have the Artemis profile and you only see these ones, we have to get the Artemis profile added. But honestly, for SpaceOAR and fiducial marker, you could just go with the brachytherapy setting. But ideally, you want to make sure the Artemis is there, because for transperineal fusion biopsy using the Artemis, we have to have that Artemis profile. So if you don't have that profile, let me know and we'll get that installed. So when this comes up, once it says Artemis, you can hit OK and close that profile. So as you know before, at this point we would turn off the auto freeze, but you can see here on this, when you're using this probe, the usual button that you press, it just brings up that profile again. So the difference on these probes to turn off the auto freeze is you have to come down, you have to use the pointer that gives you the cursor on the screen, and then you just got to use the mouse wheel to go over to the setup, hit enter, and then go down and turn off auto freeze. Hit enter, then you're good. So you'll have to do that the first time you turn on the ultrasound, just like the other procedures. You can hit pointer again to make the cursor go away. So now, even if you change the probe, the auto freeze is turned off. And if you have to reboot the ultrasound for whatever reason, you'll have to do that same thing to turn off the auto freeze. We don't want the auto freeze on during the procedures. So this concludes how to set up the probe on the ultrasound. One thing that might come up if the doctor wants to use a rolling monitor in the OR to see better, you can plug in the DVI cable into that port just like you would for the regular fusion biopsy. You know, use your DVI cable, plug it into this port, and then plug it into the DVI input. You know, the other end of the cable goes into the DVI input on a rolling monitor. And then you would just set the input on the monitor to DVI in. And the staff in the room should know how to do that. That way you can position the monitor above the patient, and the doctor can look straight at the monitor instead of having to turn his head and trying to see on this smaller monitor. But it's up to the urologist. If they want to do that, that is possible. And that concludes how to set up the ultrasound for SpaceOAR or transperineal fiducial markers.